On a freezing New York night, a homeless man sat shivering on the sidewalk, clutching a tattered Bible, when a black SUV suddenly stopped, and out stepped Donald Trump. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and with a single question, the homeless man would change both of their lives forever. The biting cold of a New York winter gnawed at the bones of those unfortunate enough to be without shelter. Among them was a man named Charlie, a figure so often ignored that he felt more like a ghost than a person. His hollow eyes and frail frame blended into the backdrop of flickering streetlights and hurried passersby. Life had been cruel to him, but tonight something extraordinary was about to happen. Charlie's trembling hands clutched a torn Bible, the pages weathered from years of use. Despite his destitution, he clung to the belief that somewhere, somehow, God would hear him. But lately, doubts gnawed at his faith. Had God forgotten him? On the corner of Fifth Avenue, Charlie saw a motorcade come to a halt. Sleek black SUVs lined the street, their tinted windows hiding the powerful figures within. A small crowd began to gather, murmurs rippling through the air. "It's him," someone whispered. "Donald Trump." Charlie blinked, disbelieving. What would a man of such wealth and stature be doing here? Clutching his Bible tighter, Charlie felt an inexplicable pull to approach. His feet moved before his mind could catch up. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was desperation, or the last flicker of hope. But he had to ask. "Mr. Trump," he called out, his voice raspy from the cold and years of neglect. The crowd parted slightly, curious but dismissive. Surely this man wouldn't command the attention of someone so powerful. But to everyone's astonishment, the president turned. Trump's eyes, sharper and more observant than people often realized, landed on Charlie. His expression was unreadable, but something in Charlie's voice must have struck a chord, because Trump gestured for his security to hold back. "What is it?" Trump asked, his voice carrying an edge of impatience, but also a flicker of intrigue. Charlie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every eye on him. His voice cracked as he spoke the question that had been haunting him for years. "Has God forgotten me?" The words hung in the icy air, heavy and raw. The crowd fell silent, their curiosity piqued. Even Trump seemed momentarily stunned. His lips parted, but no words came out. This was not the question of a man seeking charity or a handout. This was the cry of a broken soul. As the silence stretched, something remarkable began to unfold, a moment that would leave everyone there forever changed. The silence was suffocating. The crowd waited with bated breath, their attention glued to the scene unfolding before them. Even the restless hum of the city seemed to fade as Charlie's question echoed through the winter air. Donald Trump stood still, his typically brisk and commanding presence tempered by something softer, something no one could quite name. His sharp blue eyes scanned Charlie, taking in the tattered clothes, the trembling hands, and the desperation etched deep into his face. For once, the man who had always prided himself on having a quick response seemed at a loss for words. Then, finally, he spoke. "No," Trump said, his voice quieter than anyone expected. The single word carried the weight of conviction, a tone so firm it sent shivers down Charlie's spine. But Trump didn't stop there. "God doesn't forget anyone," he continued, stepping closer, his security detail watching uneasily. "But sometimes life makes us think he has. I know that feeling. I've had days where I've thought, why me? Days when I've wondered if everything I'd worked for was slipping away. But do you know what I realized?" Charlie shook his head, barely able to breathe, let alone respond. The crowd pressed in, hanging on Trump's every word. Trump pointed toward the sky. "God's plans aren't always clear to us. Sometimes, when things look the darkest, it's because he's preparing us for something bigger, something better. You haven't been forgotten, Charlie. You've been chosen." The words hit Charlie like a wave, his knees threatening to buckle under him. Chosen? He could hardly believe it. How could a man like him, a homeless nobody, be chosen for anything? But Trump wasn't done. He stepped even closer, lowering his voice as though speaking only to Charlie, though the crowd strained to hear every word. I don't know why you've been put through so much, but I do know this. You've survived it. And survival means there's something left for you to do. Something important. You just have to believe that. Tears welled up in Charlie's eyes. For years, he had felt invisible, ignored by the world, and he thought by God himself. Yet here he was, standing face to face with one of the most powerful men in the country, being told he mattered. Do you believe that? Trump asked, his tone sharp now, demanding an answer. Charlie's voice trembled. I want to, but it's hard. Trump nodded, as though he understood. That's fair. It's hard for all of us. But faith isn't about seeing the path. It's about walking it even when it's dark. And I'll tell you what, Charlie. Trump reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a crisp, neatly folded bill. I can't fix everything for you, but I can help you take the next step. The rest is up to you. He handed the bill to Charlie, who unfolded it with shaking hands. It wasn't a 20 or even 100, it was a $1,000 bill. Gasps rippled through the crowd. But Trump wasn't looking for applause. He leaned in close to Charlie, speaking words only he could hear. Whatever he said made Charlie's eyes widen and fresh tears spilled down his face. As Trump straightened up and turned back toward his waiting motorcade, Charlie fell to his knees, clutching the Bible and the bill to his chest. The crowd began murmuring, some snapping photos, others wiping their own tears. But Trump said nothing more. He climbed into the SUV, his expression unreadable, and the motorcade pulled away. As the motorcade disappeared into the city's shimmering nightscape, the crowd buzzed with speculation. What had Donald Trump said to the homeless man? What words could reduce someone like Charlie to tears? People lingered, hoping he might share. But Charlie was lost in his own world. On his knees in the slush-covered sidewalk, Charlie clutched the $1,000 bill and the Bible to his chest like lifelines. His tears fell freely, his breath coming in shaky gasps. He wasn't crying out of sadness, though. For the first time in years, something else filled his chest, hope. Trump's whispered words echoed in his mind. Simple yet profound, they felt as though they were spoken not by a man, but by some divine voice. God hasn't forgotten you, Charlie. He sent me to remind you. The words had been unexpected, even startling. Charlie wasn't sure if he believed in signs or divine intervention, but those words had felt different, weighty, purposeful, as if they carried a truth he'd been blind to. For years, he had wandered through life feeling like a shadow, invisible to the world. And now, in a moment he could never have predicted, he felt seen. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others muttering their own interpretations of what had just happened. But one young woman lingered. She crouched beside Charlie, her kind eyes searching his tear-streaked face. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Charlie nodded, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what just happened, but I feel like my life isn't over." Her smile was warm. "It's not? And maybe tonight is the beginning of something new." She reached into her bag and handed Charlie a granola bar and a bottle of water. "You've got people rooting for you now. Don't give up, okay?" Charlie managed a small smile, clutching the items as if they were treasures. The woman gave him one last encouraging pat on the shoulder before standing and disappearing into the night. Left alone, Charlie stared at the $1,000 bill, feeling its smooth texture between his fingers. It was more money than he had seen in years. For a moment, he thought about all the things he could do with it, get a warm meal, maybe even rent a room for the night. But then his eyes drifted to the Bible in his lap. He opened it, the fragile pages crackling in the cold air, and his eyes landed on a verse he had read countless times before, but never truly understood until now. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah 29 verse 11. The words burned into his soul, their meaning finally clear. Maybe this wasn't just about money or even survival. Maybe this was about a second chance, The cold night air nipped at Charlie's face as he sat on the damp sidewalk, staring at the Bible and the $1,000 bill in his lap. The crowd was gone now, their murmurs fading into the rhythm of the bustling city. He felt a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. Could what had just happened really be the turning point he'd been praying for? He stood slowly, clutching the money tightly in his hand. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of urgency, a call to act. This wasn't just money, this was an opportunity. But he also knew it was fragile. $1,000 could disappear in a single careless moment, and he would be right back where he started. No, he couldn't let that happen. Not after tonight. His first stop was a nearby diner. The warm glow of the lights and the smell of frying bacon felt like an embrace after years in the cold. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, gave him a wary glance as he walked in. Charlie was used to that look. People didn't trust someone who looked like him. But tonight, he didn't let it bother him. "Coffee and a hot meal, please," he said, sliding into a booth. He pulled a crisp $20 bill from his pocket, careful not to reveal the larger sum. The waitress's expression softened as she took the money. Moments later, a steaming plate of eggs, toast, and sausage was set before him. Charlie closed his eyes and muttered a quiet prayer of thanks before digging in. Each bite felt like nourishment for his body and soul. He hadn't realized just how empty he had been physically, emotionally, and spiritually until now. As he ate, he began to plan. The question wasn't just how he could survive the next few days, but how he could rebuild his life. Trump's words lingered in his mind. "You've survived it. And survival means there's something left for you to do." Charlie didn't know what that something was yet, but he was determined to find out. When he finished his meal, he left a generous tip and asked the waitress where he might find a nearby shelter. She scribbled an address on a napkin, her voice soft as she said, "Good luck, sweetheart." Charlie tucked the napkin into his pocket and headed into the night. The shelter was a modest building tucked between two larger structures, its entrance illuminated by a single flickering bulb. Inside it was warm and crowded. Men and women huddled in chairs, their faces lined with exhaustion and despair. Charlie recognized the look. He had worn it himself for years. As he approached the reception desk, a volunteer greeted him with a polite but distracted smile. "Name? Charlie. First time here?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice steady. "But it won't be for long." The volunteer raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Charlie was shown to a cot, where he set down his few belongings. As he lay there that night, staring at the ceiling, he made a vow. This was temporary. He wasn't just going to survive anymore, he was going to rebuild. Charlie woke before dawn, the low hum of conversation and shuffling feet around him, reminding him of where he was. The shelter was already coming alive, its residents preparing for another day of struggle. But for the first time in years, Charlie didn't feel the usual dread. He had a plan. After a quick breakfast at the shelter, a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal and a piece of bread, he walked out into the crisp morning air, his $1,000 bill still safely tucked in his coat pocket. He passed a thrift store and stopped in front of the window. His reflection stared back at him, a gaunt man in tattered clothes. If he wanted to change his life, he would need to start with how he presented himself to the world. Inside, he picked out a clean shirt, a pair of slacks, and a sturdy coat that could handle the winter chill. The cashier eyed him curiously, but didn't ask questions when he handed over the cash. Charlie changed in the store's small restroom, leaving his old clothes behind. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. He straightened his back, feeling a surge of confidence. Next, he visited a library, a place he hadn't set foot in for years. The warmth and quiet were a balm to his nerves. Sitting at a computer, he began researching job opportunities and community programs. He quickly realized that getting hired without an address or references would be difficult, but he refused to let that discourage him. He found a program that offered free career training for homeless individuals and scribbled down the details. As he prepared to leave, he noticed a man sitting at a nearby table, staring blankly at an open book. His clothes were as worn as Charlie's had been the day before. Charlie hesitated, then approached the man. "You okay?" The man looked up, startled. "I guess," he mumbled, though his downcast eyes said otherwise. Charlie sat across from him, setting the Bible on the table between them. "I know what it's like to feel lost," he said. "But I also know it doesn't have to stay that way." For the next hour, Charlie shared what he had learned, telling the man about the career training program and offering to help him sign up. By the time they parted ways, the man's face held a glimmer of hope. It was a small gesture, but it sparked something in Charlie. He realized that rebuilding his own life didn't have to be a solitary journey. If he could climb out of the darkness, maybe he could help others do the same. As the weeks passed, Charlie began attending the training program, learning skills that could help him land a job. He found part-time work sweeping floors at a community center, where the director noticed his work ethic and offered him more hours. He saved every penny he could, using the $1,000 bill sparingly, and eventually rented a small room in a boarding house. But Charlie didn't forget where he had come from. Every week, he returned to the shelter, not as a resident, but as a volunteer. He shared his story with others, encouraging them to believe in the possibility of change. Some were skeptical, but others listened, their eyes lighting up with the same hope Charlie had felt that night on the street. Word of his transformation began to spread. A local reporter wrote a story about him, calling him the man who found faith on Fifth Avenue. The article caught the attention of the young woman who had given him the granola bar that night. She reached out, and together they began organizing resources for the homeless community. Charlie stood at the podium, staring out at the crowd gathered in the modest community hall. The room was packed, men and women from the shelter, volunteers, local leaders, and even a few reporters. The lights were warm, the air electric with anticipation. He hadn't planned for this moment. It had come together almost by accident. But now that he was here, he realized this was what his journey had been leading to. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady, but thick with emotion. "A few months ago, I didn't think I'd still be alive, let alone standing here talking to you. I was broken, invisible, and convinced the world, and God, had forgotten me. But one cold night on Fifth Avenue, something happened that changed everything." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd leaned forward, eager to hear more. Charlie saw familiar faces, the shelter staff, the man he'd met in the library, now thriving in a new job, and the young woman who had handed him a granola bar on his darkest night. Their presence gave him strength. "That night I met a man I never thought I'd even see in person, Donald Trump." The mention of the name caused murmurs to ripple through the audience. Some faces lit with recognition. Others looked skeptical. And while it might sound unbelievable, he didn't just stop to talk to me. He reminded me of something I'd forgotten. He told me that God hadn't abandoned me, that I mattered, and he gave me the chance to prove it to myself. He held up the tattered Bible in his hand, the same one he had carried that night. This book, this was all I had for years. I clung to it, hoping it might someday help me make sense of my suffering. That night it finally did. Not because someone handed me a solution, but because someone reminded me that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking the next step even when you're scared. The room was silent now, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Tonight I want to tell you what I've learned. God doesn't forget us. But sometimes, we forget to see the signs he puts in our path. For me, it was a stranger stopping to listen, a young woman sharing a granola bar, and the belief that maybe, just maybe, my life wasn't over. And if you're sitting here tonight wondering if your life is over, I'm here to tell you it's not. He stepped back, letting the applause wash over him, but his mind was racing. Even as the crowd stood and clapped, he couldn't shake the feeling that his work was far from done. Something stirred inside him, a call louder than before, urging him forward. After the event, as he shook hands and exchanged words with those in attendance, a man in a suit approached. He looked official, with an air of authority Charlie couldn't quite place. Mr. Donald Trump heard about this event, the man said, extending his hand. He wanted me to pass along his regards and this. Charlie froze as the man handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, he found a short note. Charlie, I told you God hadn't forgotten you. Keep going. The world needs more reminders like you. It was signed Donald J. Trump. Charlie's hands trembled as he held the note. The weight of what it represented hit him all at once. He realized his journey wasn't just about survival, it was about something far greater. He wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was building a mission. And as he stepped out into the cold night, the crowd's voices fading behind him, Charlie couldn't help but smile. He didn't know exactly where the road would lead, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had a purpose, a fire in his heart, and the unwavering belief that his story was just beginning. Please share this story with someone who needs some hope today. And don't forget to watch more heartwarming stories on your screen.